The story of the Latin kings doesn't begin with myths or street legends. It begins with two names, King Rory and King Phil. Though both played key roles, it was King Phil who truly laid the foundation for what would become one of America's most powerful and organized street movements. In 1952, King Phil arrived in Chicago, settling in the near West Side at the intersection of Jackson Boulevard and Hoyne Avenue, a neighborhood mostly African American at the time. This area was part of the storied Laughlin and Van Buren section, but Phil didn't organize anything there. That was simply where he first landed after coming from Puerto Rico, stepping into a world that was about to change forever. By 1958, Phil and his family relocated to the Noble Square neighborhood near Egar Park along Noble Street and Chestnut Street. The area was largely Irish and Italian, sitting close to the newly formed Gaylords territory around Grand Avenue and Noble Street. The Gaylords, mainly Italian and Polish youths with a few Mexicans, didn't take kindly to the growing number of Puerto Rican families moving in. Egar Park quickly became a pressure point of racial tension. The Gaylords didn't officially claim the park, but it was their hangout, documented even by social services in 1961. When Puerto Rican kids began showing up there, things turned hostile. During that same year, as the Gaylords were organizing into an official club, other white gangs were forming nearby. The C-Notes, Key West, and the Playboys, all born in 1958. The area became a borderland of cultures: Italian, Polish, Irish, Mexican, Ukrainian, and violence soon followed. When King Phil moved in, he joined a local gang called the Aces, but the Aces were outnumbered, losing battles to the better organized white gangs. Then came Phil's idea, a rebrand, something to strike fear into their enemies. In 1958, he renamed the group the Skulls. The new name carried weight. It projected power, mystery, and intimidation. It drew new members, strengthened alliances, and gave them a sense of identity in a city that didn't want them. By March 1959, the Skulls were recognized in official social services documents, proof they had become one of the toughest gangs in Egar Park. That same year, the park erupted in a racial storm brewing across Chicago's west side. But as the Skulls gained ground, the city was changing beneath their feet. The construction of the Dan Ryan Expressway displaced thousands of people, tearing through neighborhoods labeled as slums. Families, especially Puerto Rican and African American, were forced to relocate. Many of them found new homes in Egar Park and Humboldt Park. Humboldt Park was divided into two sides, east and west, separated by the park itself. West Humboldt Park was mostly Italian and Jewish, while East Humboldt Park mixed Polish, Scandinavian, Italian, German, and Jewish communities. Nearby, Garfield Park was undergoing its own transformation. Once largely Jewish, it was now becoming predominantly African American, with some Puerto Rican migration too. The expressway displacement pushed even more families north toward the border of Ferdinand Street and Franklin Boulevard. By the late 1950s, the racial lines were redrawn. White flight began, especially north of Garfield Park up to Chicago Avenue, as home values dropped and the area became redlined. Territorial tension grew. White gangs began to rise, naming themselves after their turf: Chicago and Lawndale, Chicago Avenue Gang, Harden Drakers. According to the 1960 U.S. Census, Humboldt Park was just 1% black, but those numbers hid the truth. It was also home to a growing Puerto Rican population that the census didn't record. By 1958, Puerto Ricans were settling near Chicago Avenue, drawn from the La Madison area along Madison Street, a known Puerto Rican enclave that stretched into West Garfield Park, but they were not welcomed. The new arrivals faced harassment and violence. In response, Puerto Rican youths began banding together near Kesey Avenue and Ohio Street, forming what became known as the Kesey and Ohio Boys. By 1963, they defended their streets and schools, especially around Samuel Morse Elementary, now Polaris Academy, against both white and black gangs who sought to drive them out. Meanwhile, another wave of Puerto Rican families settled further north, in East Humboldt Park, around Maplewood Avenue and Wabansia Avenue, gathering at Maplewood Park. Many of these families had been displaced not just by the Dan Ryan Project, but by the demolition of the Old Town Settlement Law Clark in 1959, cleared to make room for the Carl Sandburg luxury condos. Among those who moved into Humboldt Park were the Haches Viejas, a group of older Puerto Rican men who once protected the Old Town community. After displacement, they spread throughout the city, keeping influence but largely aging out of the street-level conflicts that were now dominated by youth. From this new generation emerged a fresh name, the Noble Knights, a Puerto Rican gang from northern East Humboldt Park, defending their neighborhoods from North Avenue to Division Street and from Humboldt Park to Western Avenue. Their enemies were fierce, the Jokers of Cortez and Washtenaw and Simon City from Drake and Wabenzia. The Jokers, a gang so violent that the Chicago Tribune compared them to the Black P. Stones and Disciples, were known for their racism. They patrolled Division Street and Sacramento Boulevard, forbidding Hispanics or blacks from crossing. Simon City, formed in 1956, was equally ruthless. Mostly Italian, rooted near West Humboldt Park and Logan Square, they often clashed with the Jokers, but both turned their aggression toward Puerto Rican youths trying to find safety in their own community. In the middle of this rising chaos, the Puerto Rican gangs of Humboldt Park were fighting not just for territory, but for survival, for respect, and for an identity in a city that wanted to erase them. And it was from this storm of displacement, pride, and defiance that the foundation of the Latin Kings began to take shape. By the late 1950s, Chicago's Wicker Park began to change. New faces appeared, Puerto Rican and Cuban families arriving for the first time, drawn by hope, pushed by displacement. When Fidel Castro seized power in Cuba in 1959, waves of refugees fled north. Some landed right here, along Milwaukee Avenue, between Wicker Park and Bucktown, where the edges of Logan Square met, but the welcome wasn't kind. This stretch of the city was still dominated by German, Irish, and Polish communities, and its many youths were met with hostility, slurs, and fists. They fought back, squaring off with local white gangs, carving out small pieces of survival one street at a time. Among those early fighters were the Imperials, believed to be tied to the Levitt and Schiller corner, a block that would soon become sacred ground in Latin King history, some say. Josie, Caddock, Joe, Rivera was among them before ever claiming the Latin King name, joining the fight at only 12 years old. Meanwhile, in the early 1960s, King Phil and his Skulls were hauling on by grit and fearlessness. The white gangs that surrounded them, the Gaylords, C-Notes, and Playboys, outnumbered the Skulls heavily. The only thing keeping Phil's group alive was the fact that those white gangs were not yet united. Egar Park became a battleground. The Skulls stood their ground as the Gaylords tried and failed to claim the park. By 1963, the Gaylords had grown so large that many in the Hispanic community called them the Polish Mafia. They controlled the streets through intimidation and beatdowns, often targeting Puerto Rican youths who dared to walk along California Avenue or play inside Humboldt Park. The Skulls fought back, winning skirmishes that became legend until the white gangs retaliated. In one brutal street attack, Kingfield was nearly killed. His enemies weren't satisfied with a single victory. They wanted complete control. By the summer of 1963, the Gaylords, C-Notes, and Lazy Gents reached a truce, forming what became known as the PVP Alliance. Together, they issued a chilling threat. Every building that housed Puerto Ricans would be burned to the ground if the Skulls didn't disappear. Phil didn't back down. Instead, he reached out. That same summer, he met Freddie Avalez and the Ohio Akezi boys, who were fighting the same war against the same enemies. Together, they sought to unify under one name, one banner that would make their enemies think twice. The Skulls wanted to keep their name, Freddie's crew wanted something new, and then one voice, a 14-year-old named Cookie, spoke up with an idea that would change street history forever. He said Latin Kings. The name struck deep. Royalty born from struggle. Dignity reclaimed from concrete. According to a 1969 article in Rising Up Angry, members recalled how the Kings of Ohio and Spalding joined forces with another group, choosing a leader named Nando, a story that mirrored King Phil's own version almost exactly with just minor differences. But behind the names and details, one truth stood clear. The Latin Kings were born out of unity, survival, and the need to protect their own. With the threats mounting and his own family in danger, King Phil left Eckhart Park and moved north to Leven and Schiller in Wicker Park, the intersection that would become the first headquarters of the Latin Kings. His co-founder and co-leader was King Rory. On Friday, May 15, 1964, the city baked in early summer heat, 83 degrees and restless. Phil and his friends met at the Association House on Kesey and Haddon Avenue, just a block from Division and Kesey in West Humboldt Park. It was after school, the week closing, the air thick with tension and possibility. Inside that community center, two names went up for a vote, Skulls and Latin Kings. Hands rose into the air. The majority chose Latin Kings, Among them, King Phil raised his hand. The Brotherhood was born. Freddie became King Freddie, leading the Ohio and Kedzie Kings. King Phil took charge of Levitt and Schiller, the heart of the new organization. Across the street stood John's Tavern at 2153 West Schiller, a landmark for early members until it closed in 1966. Their main apartment building sat directly opposite Sabin Elementary, the nerve center of what would grow into an empire. The first Latin kings were mostly Puerto Rican, but not exclusively. They welcomed Mexican, African American, Polish, German, Italian, and even Japanese members. It wasn't about race, it was about respect and the fight for dignity in a city that denied it. In the mid-1960s, the Latin kings preferred diplomacy over domination. They hung out with the Playboys, PVV in certain parts of West Town, sought peace with other Hispanic gangs, young sinners, young lords, Spanish kings, scorpions, Latin angels, paragons, but found their strongest bond with the warlords of Wicker Park. Rumors spread that members of the FALN, a Puerto Rican independence movement, sometimes stayed at Leavitt and Schiller. They were friendly with the kings, but not allies in violence. The Latin kings didn't engage in terror. They weren't radicals. At most, they absorbed ideas of pride and resistance, but never anti-Americanism. Their mission was simple, noble, and powerful. They protected the kids who were beaten on their way to school. They confronted landlords who cheated families out of rent. They stood up to police when officers harassed or abused their neighbors. They guarded their blocks, their people, and the dignity of anyone too poor or powerless to fight back. Their purpose was summed up in 3 founding principles, written not on paper, but in loyalty and blood. Protect our families. Protect our neighborhoods. Protect each other. The city took a while to notice. There were no headlines, no police reports, not until 1965, when the Chicago Tribune first printed the name Latin Kings after a stabbing incident near Gaylord Turf. The listed addresses pointed back to Kedzie in Ohio, one downtown location, and even West Garfield Park, proof that the Latin Kings were already spreading their reach. Among those early members was Don Juan, who had grown up in East Garfield Park, carrying the code and spirit of the original Latin Kings into every new corner of Chicago. By the mid-1960s, Chicago's Latin Kings were evolving from a neighborhood brotherhood into something far more structured, and their roots spread across the city like veins through a living organism. It all started in 1964, near Levitt and Schiller, across from Sabin Elementary School. There, a small restaurant called Mom and Pop's became the heartbeat of their daily life. The place had a jukebox, the sound of soul and doo-wop spilling out into the streets as young Latin kids gathered, dreaming of brotherhood and power. Just 2 buildings north of that restaurant, in a basement they called Pets, they opened their first official clubhouse. It was inside that dimly lit room, filled with cigarette smoke and raw ambition, that the very first Latin King crown was drawn in the fall of 1965. The Latin Queens were also born there that same year, founded by a Polish girl named Laura. What began as neighborhood unity was quickly turning into a movement with symbols, structure, and pride. Among those early legends was Jose Cadillac Joe Rivera, one of Phil's closest from Leavitt and Schiller. Born December 6, 1946, he was old enough to move with the first wave. He drove sleek Cadillacs, his personal statement of success, and by the early 1970s, he had shifted his operation to Beach and Spalding in West Humboldt Park. By the end of that decade, Cadillac Joe was running serious narcotics trade, becoming one of the biggest dealers in the area, until his 1979 conviction for delivering controlled substances. He spent 6 years behind bars, and when he came out, near 40, the streetlight of his prime had already dimmed. But as some stories faded, new corners began to rise. In East Village, at Noble and Cortez, a young Latin king named Michael Perez started another branch in 1964. Rivalry sparked instantly across Ashland Street, where the Harrison Gents moved in that same year. The Playboys were close by, and Gaylords clashed heavily with these new Latin kings. The block became a battlefield. By 1965, the original corner was passed down to younger members, and the veterans opened a new front at Ashland and Cortez. That section didn't last long, only until 1971, when the remaining kings shifted again, this time to Crystal and Damon in Wicker Park. Short-lived or not, Ashland and Cortez became legendary, remembered for its loyalty and its soldiers who never backed down. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, a different legend carried the fire. Juan King Papo Santos, a name whispered in early Chicago lore, is often credited as one of the movement's defining figures. He and his circle claimed the corner of Laughlin and Van Buren, where they spent their days in front of a small store and their nights inside a large yellow apartment building that housed many of the earliest members. Regular faces there included Bald Spot Slim, Weasel, Fast Eddie Gonzalez, Santos' brother, and Billy Roman, his cousin. They dined at a small restaurant locals called the Greasy Spoon, their unofficial command post. Some legends trace the 1954 data origin to Santos, but written records show that no official Latin Kings group operated there until 1964, when Santos and his crew aligned under the growing ALKM movement. Despite that, Laughlin and Van Buren was never considered an official section in the mid-60s. Kingfield and Santos weren't directly connected. Yet the name Papo still carried weight, the kind that built mythologies before paperwork ever did. By 1966, the story reached the boulevards 24th and Marshall Boulevard in Little Village, where Don Juan was appointed to lead the newest generation. These men had deep roots from the near west side, specifically University Village, but after their old neighborhood was demolished in 1962, they relocated to Little Village and began calling themselves the Mar Kings or Marshall Boulevard Kings. According to police records later examined by gang researcher George Knox, the Mar Kings may have evolved directly from an earlier group called the Royal Kings that once ruled the University Village area. Drawings from the early 1960s even showed their turf at Roosevelt Road and Newberry labeled simply Markings. By 1966, that same group had officially transformed into Latin Kings, marking the birth of the Boulevards, the third Latin King section in history. It's believed that King Phil and King Rory were still overseeing operations at that time and may have personally authorized Don Juan's move. While some stories credit King Papo with bringing the Latin Kings to the boulevards, most evidence points to Don Juan as the man who truly planted the flag. When the Boulevard section rose in the summer of 1966, it drew informal members of several other local gangs, the Mar Kings, Supreme Cliques, 23rd Street Boys, and 26th Street Jokers, forming a melting pot of white and Hispanic youth under one crown. With many gaylords shipped off to Vietnam, Little Village was wide open for new leadership. The Latin Kings filled that vacuum quickly. But they weren't alone. New rivals like the Harrison Gents, Artistics, Morgan Deuces, Satan Disciples, and Sin City Boys soon challenged their rise. The Ridgeway Lords, however, chose the opposite side, becoming close allies of the Kings, united against the rest. It was during this same year that Latin King influence spilled beyond the city line. In Cicero, at Johnny's Top Hat nightclub on 22nd and Cicero Avenue, a known Italian mobster hangout, a man called Serbian John started the first Suburban Latin King chapter. A pimp with strong mob ties, he brokered early relationships with the Archdukes of Cicero and helped the Kings gain acceptance in the largely white community, paving the way for later expansion. Though the Cicero chapter faded in the early 70s, its legacy marked the first suburban step for the empire. Back at 24th and Marshall, the early figures, Scarface, Dino, Don Zorn, Black Sal, White Sal, Crazy Man, and Little Boy built the structure that would define the South Side for decades. Don, originally from the North, was appointed leader and the location proved strategic. It linked students from Harrison High School and Spry Elementary, many of whom were busting from the near West Side, bringing new recruits with them. How long Don Zorn led remains unclear. Some say he was replaced by Dino by 1972. Others suggest they may have been the same man under different aliases. Regardless, the boulevards became the command post for the Lion King's southern network, the birthplace of branches that would later dominate both city and suburban territories. By the late 1960s, the Little Village chapter had grown diverse. Nearly half its members were white, reflecting the neighborhood's demographic before the 1970s. It was here, at 24th and Marshall, where the Chicago Latin Kings truly began to split into two powerful halves, the Puerto Rican-dominated North Side and the Mexican-dominated South Side. The crown was no longer just a symbol drawn in a basement. It had become a living force, spreading, evolving, and preparing for a new era that would soon test its unity and redefine its legacy. By 1966, the demographic map of West Humboldt Park was shifting. South of Chicago Avenue, African American communities were increasingly taking root, and the Puerto Rican population found themselves out of place in the changing landscape. The natural response was migration northward toward Division and Kedzie, an area once strictly controlled by the mostly Italian community. With white flight running its course, the Puerto Rican families seized the opportunity, and the Kedzie and Ohio Latin Kings moved alongside them, staking claim to new streets, most notably Beach and Spalding. At the time, the noble knights already dominated the area, guarding the older Puerto Rican settlement that had been displaced by UIC construction. Recognizing the benefits of unity, the Kedzie and Ohio Latin Kings encouraged the noble knights to integrate, effectively folding them into the Latin Kings. With the knights' allegiance secured, history was being rewritten. Neighborhoods once independent became part of the growing Latin King network. Meanwhile, Maplewood Park and East Humboldt Park also fell under the Latin Kings' influence. This expansion came from another branch led not by Phil, but by Julio Campa Munoz, who established headquarters at Maplewood and Wabansia. That group likely traced its origins to the Laughlin and Van Buren Kings, marking the subtle interweaving of earlier Latin King factions across Chicago. By this point, King Phil and King Rory may have already stepped back from active leadership. Reports suggest that both men had left Chicago for a period to focus on family life, avoiding street conflicts. During their absence, the Latin Kings were no longer a small, localized club. They had grown into a citywide presence, spanning Westtown and Humboldt Park. Upon their return, Phil and Rory were reportedly stunned by the scale and organization their creation had achieved. It was in this environment, after the Division riot, that the legend of Juan Ramon Santos began to take hold. Many regard Santos as a founder of the nation, while others insist King Phil holds that title. The truth likely resides somewhere in between. Phil was indisputably the architect of the Akan Latin Kings, the structured nation that persists today. Santos, however, had led an older group that called themselves the Latin Kings independently, predating Phil's organization. When Phil and Rory stepped back, Santos' faction naturally filled the leadership void within the ALN, reinforcing his legendary status. Accounts from Joseph Lil Rat Carrillo, a Harrison Jensen Santos bodyguard in the mid-1980s, clarify this distinction. Santos never claimed to have founded the ALN, nor did he link the organization to New York. While Santos' ideals and early influence predate Phil, there is no direct evidence that his version of the Latin Kings persisted beyond 1960. King Phil's story, corroborated by social services documents, gang migration patterns, and 1958 Humboldt Park riots, aligns with documented historical events. Santos, though real, became mythologized, a precursor whose legacy was absorbed into the ALN rather than supplanting it. By 1966, the Akan Latin Kings were expanding north and south, bridging communities from Division and Kedzie, Maplewood Park, and Beach and Spalding. The organization had become more than a gang. It was a protective force, a citywide network, and a living testament to the foresight of its original architects. Phil and Rory's presence may have waned temporarily, but their foundational vision had taken root, shaping the streets and defining the next chapter of Latin King history. By the mid-1960s, Zuan King Papo Santos had arrived on the scene at Leavitt and Schiller, likely drawn by his connection to King Barlos' sister. Santos brought with him decades of street knowledge and stories of protecting the Puerto Rican population in the Laughlin and Van Buren area from predatory African American gangs. With Phil and Rory reportedly stepping away around 1966, Santos recognized an opportunity for leadership within the Akan Latin Kings. At approximately 26 years old, he became a compelling figure for younger members like Gustavo Lord Gino Colin and Jose Cadillac Joe Rivera, both just 14 at the time. On June 12, 1966, the Division Street riots erupted, sparked by the unjust killing of a Puerto Rican man by Chicago police. Fueled by outrage, the Latin Kings and young lords stormed the streets, fighting against police oppression. It was during this turmoil that Santos, alongside Eddie L.B. Bronco and King Tiger, solidified an alliance with the young lords, a partnership that would endure. That same day, the Latin Kings made their first headlines nationally, boosting both recruitment and public awareness, while simultaneously alerting law enforcement to their growing influence. With the flipping of the Noble Knights in 1966, the Latin Kings inherited their former territory spanning North Avenue to Division and Western Avenue to Humboldt Park. centering activity at Maplewood and Wabunzia. Here they operated a pop, chips, sandwich, and candy shop at Hirsch and Rockwell, directly across from Von Humboldt School, with a clubhouse on the second floor. This section became a protective force for the Puerto Rican community, even allowing the original maniac Latin disciples to operate peacefully in 1966, a gesture that would later lead to conflict in the late 1970s. Notably, Julio Campa Munoz, a key Latin king figure in this section, would later be imprisoned for murder in 1976, leading to the section's closure in 1979 after Spanish Cobras and maniac Latin disciples exploited his absence. The 1966 conquest expanded further into Humboldt Park and Westtown, seemingly under the strategic leadership of King Papo. The Latin kings dismantled rival Hispanic gangs systematically. Scorpions of Wicker Park disbanded after the death of their leader, Sleepy, in 1965. Latin Angels from Maplewood in division. The Junior Paragons at Washtenaw and Potomac. Young Sinners of Wicker Park, whose leader Charlie was hospitalized for 2 months after a solo challenge at Peace Clubhouse. And the Hearst Street Lords of West Humboldt Park, clearing the path toward Beach and Spalding. This expansion demonstrated the transition of power in West Humboldt Park, from predominantly white gangs to a robust Puerto Rican presence. By 1967, Beach and Spalding had officially become the new center of Latin King activity in northern West Humboldt Park, supervised by a leader known as Batman, and served as the hub for citywide coordination, even as Leavitt and Schiller remained the official headquarters. Meanwhile, the Latin Kings made strategic alliances northward in Lincoln Park. With the young lords declaring an end to their gangbanging days, Latin Kings entered Armitage and Dayton under the guidance of King Richie, a relative of Santos. They were welcome rather than fought, serving as muscle for the young lords, protecting the community from corrupt police, slumlords, and predatory urban renewal programs. Eventually, the Latin Kings established a base at Armitage and Sheffield, maintaining a presence in Lincoln Park until the 1990s, when gentrification reshaped the neighborhood. During this period, the Kings also allied with local Hispanic gangs such as the Halstead and Armitage Paragons, further solidifying their influence in the area. By the end of 1966, the Aukna Latin Kings had transformed from a small local club into a citywide protective network, strategically controlling key Hispanic neighborhoods across Chicago. Under the leadership of figures like King Papo, King Phil, King Rory, and King Richie, the Latin Kings not only protected their communities but also established a blueprint for organization, diplomacy, and territorial dominance that would define their rise for decades to come. By 1966, the Latin Kings had spread beyond their original northern Westtown and Humboldt Park strongholds. In Pilsen, they were initially barred from forming, but an alliance with the Rampants opened the door. The Kings established a new section at Coulter and Damen, initially called the Coulter Counts, under the leadership of Abel Bull Torres. In 1968, after several Rampants flips, this section became known as the Coulter Kings, a hardcore faction that lasted until 1987. Over the years, the Coulter Kings would branch out, including the notorious 50 Cert and Ada chapter and Back to the Yards, proving themselves a formidable force despite being smaller than rivals like the Ambrose and Latin Count. Meanwhile, on the south side, a lesser-known chapter emerged at 27th and Normal in Bridgeport. Their clubhouse at 2702 South Normal Street was marked with spray-painted Latin King lettering. However, this chapter suffered a setback in 1969 when members were implicated in a controversial People v. Galvin case involving a disputed gang raid. The chapter disbanded that year, but Latin Kings would return to Bridgeport in 1978 with a new stronghold at 33rd and Morgan, which became a notorious and enduring chapter. In Inglewood, the Latin Kings arrived in 1966 at 57th and Halstead to protect Puerto Rican residents from encroaching Devil's Disciples, Gangster Disciples / Black Disciples. Relations with other local Puerto Rican gangs like the Village Sharks and Emerald Knights were tense. In 1968, the formation of the Latin Souls at 55th and Halstead created additional tension, leading to bitter rivalries. The Chicago Tribune specifically documented the Inglewood Latin Kings at 57th and Halstead on June 11, 1969. By the mid-1970s, as Puerto Rican families left and African American gangs moved in, this section closed. Even as the Latin Kings expanded territorially, they began showing a commitment to community activism. By 1968, leaders like Don Zawan led neighborhood cleanup initiatives in Westtown and Humboldt Park, erasing gang graffiti and demonstrating the Kings' potential as community assets. While some factions remained focused on gangbanging, the leadership increasingly pursued legitimacy, political engagement, and alliances with other Hispanic and white gangs. By 1969, the Latin Kings were actively involved in addressing police brutality, confronting crooked landlords, and assisting with community programs like free lunch initiatives for children. These efforts coincided with the clear rise of Xuan King Papo Santos as a national figure. A 1969 Rising Up Angry article noted that under the leadership of Papo and Tarzan, the Latin Kings started moving into the political realm. No more gang bopping, fight the real enemy, all power to all the people. The Latin Kings also expanded into Logan Square in 1969, following the migration of Puerto Rican families. Here, they encountered slow white flight patterns and entrenched white greaser gangs who preyed on Hispanic youths. The presence of hostile forces like the Simon City Gang and the recruiting activities of the Gaylords in Palmer Square and Lawndale made protection necessary. The Kings established new sections at North and Kezie, Armitage and Kezie and Lawrence, and Kezie engaging in brutal conflicts with the Gaylords and other hostile white gangs. These battles solidified Latin King dominance in Logan Square, where they remained permanently. The same year, the Uptown community faced rising crime and tensions fueled by Hispanic and African American migration. In response, Latin Kings opened a chapter at Winthrop and Ainsley to protect newcomers from the Gaylords, Uptown Rebels, Kenmore Boys, Black Gangster Disciples, and Conservative Vice Lords. This chapter included both Hispanic and white members and found early alliance with the Harrison Gents, who were only a block away. These two gangs would maintain a close relationship until conflicts in 1979. Uptown remains a permanent stronghold of the Latin Kings to this day. By 1969, the Latin Kings had evolved into more than just a street gang. Through strategic expansion across Chicago's north, west, and south sides, coupled with civic engagement and alliances, they had positioned themselves as protectors of the Puerto Rican community, gaining both influence and legitimacy while simultaneously building the foundations for a nationwide organization. By the early 1970s, the Latin Kings faced a pivotal turning point. Under King Papo, the organization had been involved in the drug trade, though it never fully controlled the gang's operations in the way some feared. In fact, the Kings often prided themselves on eliminating unauthorized dealers in their communities, sometimes robbing them outright. Papo himself had partnered with Big Gato of the Spanish Lords in the late 1960s to rob heroin dealers, though indulgence in their own seizures would eventually lead both men into addiction. By 1970, King Papo was struggling with heroin, and many sections of the Latin Kings were disorganized, placing the nation at risk of collapse. The violence of the era was underscored by two high-profile murders in June 1971. On the 20th, Raul B.K. Gonzalez shot Ernesto Villagomez's uncle at 24th and Sacramento after prior conflicts involving the Bishop's Gang, an act which would land Gonzalez in prison. People versus Gonzalez, 1974. A week later, on June 27th, Gustavo Hercules Colin killed Glenn Burr at Leverton, Potomac after a confrontation with a vice lord, nearly killing another woman before the gun jammed. Colin will later be sentenced to 30 to 60 years in prison. People versus Colin, 1974. These back-to-back convictions highlighted the instability of the organization and created an urgent need for order. By 1972, the Latin Kings were at a crossroads. Rampant drug use, disorganization, and ongoing gang wars threatened the very survival of the nation. With key members like Hercules and Rayo behind bars, leadership needed restructuring. A critical meeting was held in prison with Manuel Diaz Rodriguez, Johnny Martinez, Eddie Dino, Sunchild, Hercules, and Rayo, resulting in the drafting of the King's Manifesto. This document would guide the organization, establishing strict rules such as banning all drugs except marijuana. The manifesto also reflected the results of a 1972 election in which Papo stepped down due to his heroin issues. Leadership was redistributed. Gustavo Hercules Colin assumed control of northern operations as Lord Gino, while Raul Rayo Gonzalez oversaw southwest and south side operations, earning the nickname Baby King as Papo's protege. Problematic members were expelled. Addicted kings were forced to quit heroin immediately, and the organization stabilized under its new constitution. Activism took a revolutionary turn, particularly at Levitt and Schiller, where the Latin Kings had previously worked with the Puerto Rican extremist group FALN. Once authorities cracked down on FALN, the Kings severed ties and vacated the location. King Papo relocated, helping to establish a new section at Division and Walcott, while younger members remained at Levitt and Schiller, eventually forming the Insane Unknown. By 1972, Beach and Spalding became the new governing Northside section, replacing Levitt and Schiller as the central hub. Other sections rose in prominence during this period. Wild West, where Winthrop and Winona clashed with the Thorndale Jag-Offs, TJO, a gang led by Joe Ganshi and Gary Kellis. This conflict in 1974 resulted in fatalities and prison sentences for TJO leaders. The Kings eventually pushed north, solidifying a presence at Berwyn and Winthrop. Leland and Virginia, Lincoln Square, 1975, with increasing Hispanic migration into the historically Greek conservative community of Lincoln Square. Local gangs like the Gaylords and Insane Popes opposed newcomers. The Latin Kings established a section at Leland and Virginia to protect Hispanic and other youths, ensuring a permanent foothold in the area. By 1972, with the Kings Manifesto, new leadership and strategic expansion, the Latin Kings had transformed from a disorganized street gang into a disciplined, politically aware organization. Lord Gino and Baby King now led the nation with structure, authority, and an eye toward both community protection and organizational dominance. By 1975, the Latin Kings were entering a new era of expansion and consolidation, taking strategic positions across the city and beyond. In North Center, the Julia C. Lathrop homes became a focal point. Though the Latin Kings had been present in the project since the gang's earliest days, leadership was originally in the hands of their allies, the Insane Deuces. That year, the Deuce ceded control of the southernmost section of the projects, known as the Horseshoe, stretching from Horn to Livet along Diversity Parkway to the Latin Kings. Together, they fought fiercely against rival gangs like the Simon City Royals and the Paulina Berry community. Tensions would later erupt over the crack cocaine trade in the late 1980s, culminating in outright war by 1989. When the Deuces eventually flipped to the Folk Nation in 1992, they abandoned the projects, leaving the Latin Kings in full control, sharing space only with select African American gangs. The Latin Kings would maintain their presence in these buildings until the city began closing them in the early 2010s. One of the most notorious figures during this period was Zulio Compa Munoz, an original member of the Imperials and one of the earliest Latin Kings predating the Ocnaya era. Born in 1936, Compa was one of the oldest and most respected figures in the nation. On December 17, 1975, Compa orchestrated a robbery that would end in murder. Alongside a prostitute, Deborah Shack, and accomplices, Victor Figueroa and Ralphie Munoz, they lured a client under the guise of a sexual encounter to rob him. After receiving a meager payment, Compa shot the victim, Peter Mobiles, in the head, killing him. Shack later testified against Compa, leading to his conviction, People vs. Munoz, 1979. The repercussions of testifying against a high-ranking Latin king were severe. Victor Figueroa, who had cooperated with the state in 1976, was hunted by the Latin Kings and ultimately found murdered on February 23, 1979 in East Humboldt Park. According to court documents, Figueroa was shot multiple times in the chest in a gruesome execution that symbolized the consequences of betrayal. People vs. Perez, 1983. Compa would remain in prison until his death in 2012, and the East Humboldt Park Latin King section effectively dissolved after his incarceration. Meanwhile, Latin Kings were also establishing themselves in Rogers Park, along Howard Street at the Jonquil Terrace Apartments near Howard and Ashland. They clashed with white gangs, including the Howard Street Greasers, to protect Hispanic youths. Their influence would eventually extend west to Potawatomi Park, where they held sway until the mid-1990s, before the area became predominantly African American. In 1976, the Latin Kings expanded into the suburbs, marking a historic moment in the gang's evolution. The first suburban chapter emerged in Maywood, where Hispanic families were settling amid a frustrated, mostly white community facing unemployment and economic decline. Ned from 2003 and Christiana spearheaded the effort, recruiting his cousin Pee-wee and friends to form the nucleus of a tightly run, organized chapter at 5th Avenue and Lake Street. The suburban expansion was as much about protection as it was about power. The Maywood Latin Kings defended Hispanic families against discrimination and hostility while building a permanent disciplined branch, the first of its kind in the suburbs. They soon spread into Melrose Park and Stone Park, assisting communities in need. By the late 1970 and early 1980, these suburban kings were embroiled in violent conflicts with rival city gangs encroaching on their territory, but their original mission of protection remained central. Over time, Maywood became a hub from which the Latin kings extended influence across numerous south and west suburbs, reaching as far as northern Indiana. By the late 1980 and early 1990, the suburban network of Latin kings was firmly entrenched, serving as a backbone for the nation's expansion outside Chicago. By 1976, the Latin kings' influence was spreading rapidly into Chicago's suburbs, following the migration patterns of Hispanic communities. Melrose Park, long known for a strong Italian presence and ties to organized crime, became a focal point. While the neighborhood had been conservative and racially tense, new Mexican families arriving on the southwest side faced harassment and attacks from local Italian youths. The Latin kings moved in to protect these families and local businesses along Broadway Avenue and Lake Street, establishing the first protective stronghold in Melrose Park. Through the early 1980s, these kings clashed with black gangster disciples from nearby Maywood, but they survived police crackdowns and remained active, becoming the only enduring gang presence in the suburb. Simultaneously, the jungle area in Franklin Park, an isolated apartment and townhouse enclave, saw Latin king settlers in 1976. Prior to the Latin kings' arrival, Hispanic youths faced harassment from the Simon City Royals. The Latin kings, tied closely to Maywood and Melrose Park chapters, provided protection and community cohesion. By 1979, the imperial gangsters and maniac Latin disciples arrived, sparking a violent gang war in the area. The Latin kings managed to push the maniac Latin disciples out by the mid-1980s, but ultimately could not dislodge the imperial gangsters, leading to their eventual exit between 1986 and 1987. In 1977, Latin kings expanded into Montrose and Hazel, a cluster of severely run-down apartments in a predominantly Hispanic and African-American area. Here, the Latin kings confronted the vice lords, Brazers, and Harrison Gents while providing protection to local youths. By 1980, with the Brazers leaving their area, the Latin kings expanded into Clarendon Park, solidifying Montrose and Hazel as a key uptown stronghold. Meanwhile, in Bridgeport, the Latin kings' initial efforts had faltered in the late 1960s after a gang rape case ended the first chapter. The Cullerton Deuces attempted a foothold in the 1970s but were replaced by the Warlords in 1977. By 1978, the Latin kings successfully took over 33rd and Morgan, flipping the Warlords and establishing a permanent chapter. From that point, the 30th and Morgan Latin kings battled rivals like the Saint Disciples, maintaining control over the neighborhood for decades. Even into the 2010s, black and gold 5-point crown merchandise could still be seen in local stores, a testament to their enduring influence. The late 1970s also brought violent clashes and notoriety to other parts of the city. On June 4, 1977, another Division Street riot erupted after police shot 2 Puerto Rican youths. Looting and vandalism spread, with the Latin kings and Spanish cobras engaged in fierce street battles against one another. Around the same time in Little Village, gang wars escalated as 2-6 grew and the Satan Disciples sought to expand west of Marshall Boulevard. A notable standoff saw roughly 20 Latin kings exchange gunfire with 20 Satan Disciples, with one of the shooters being Josie La China Contreras, a formidable Latin queen from the boulevards. La China's reputation for courage and skill stood alongside her brothers during these violent confrontations. In 1978, the Latin kings of North Ave and Kezie in West Humboldt Park executed a major heist, ambushing a military vehicle at the nearby Illinois National Guard Armory. They seized thousands of dollars worth of high-powered weapons, establishing themselves as one of the most heavily armed gangs in Chicago for years to come. By 1979, the Latin kings sought to reclaim Leavitt and Schiller, now run by the Insane Unknown. Through negotiation, the Latin kings returned as allies, a partnership that would last until the mid-2010s. The late 1970s also coincided with broader societal shifts. Illinois faced a prison overcrowding crisis, leading to early release programs between 1979 and 1982. Simultaneously, economic decline and job loss in Chicago, neighborhoods like South Deering and South Chicago, coupled with white flight from aging suburbs, created new opportunities for gang expansion. Latin kings released from prison naturally migrated alongside Hispanic communities into new suburbs and South Side neighborhoods, further broadening the organization's reach. One such area was Rosemont and Claremont in West Ridge, where racial transitions began in 1975 as Jewish families moved out and Hispanic, African American, Pakistani, and Indian populations moved in. Among the new arrivals, the Assyrian Eagles initially defended the Arab community. By 1979, Hispanic migration brought Latin kings into the area, flipping the Assyrian Eagles into the Assyrian kings. This kings quickly became a dominant force, battling rival gangs like the Simon City Royals and Insane Poets for control. Through this period, the Latin kings were no longer a city-bound gang. They had become a multi-neighborhood, multi-suburban organization, strategically placing themselves to protect their communities, assert dominance, and expand their influence in both Chicago and its suburbs. By 1979, the Latin Kings' presence was no longer confined to Chicago proper. They had begun a full-scale suburban expansion throughout Cook and Kane counties. In Berwyn, Latin Kings were among the earliest suburban settlers. Despite decades of gang wars and heavy police crackdowns, this chapter endured, carving a lasting foothold in the community. Further south, Chicago Heights had become racially divided since the mid-1960s as white residents vacated the east side. African American gangs like the Black P. Stones and Black Gangster Disciples dominated the south side, while Mexican families began moving into the southwest portion. Latin Kings arrived in 1979, recruiting heavily near 15th Street and Campbell Avenue, protecting Mexican-owned businesses from conflicts with local gangs. Over time, the Latin Kings expanded their influence across the southwest side, outlasting rivals such as the Latin Counts, who would engage in a major war with them during the 1990s. Cicero's Grant Works area also became a Latin King hub in 1979. Mexican families newly arriving in the suburb were immediately protected by a small Latin King crew. Led by a 16-year-old white member, they allied with established Cicero gangs like the Noble Knights, 12th Street Players, and Archdukes, while engaging in open conflict with the Ridgeway Lords. That same year, their leader Wayne Haystick was killed in a home invasion, and the Cicero chapter made headlines for rampant graffiti. Though this first Cicero chapter dissolved by 1980, it laid the groundwork for future Latin King settlements in the suburb. To the northwest, Latin Kings arrived in Displacement in 1979, settling in a south side townhouse complex near Pine Court. These townhouses, built in the early 1960s, had deteriorated into rough areas by the late 70s. From this location, they clashed with Imperial gangsters in nearby Apache Park, establishing one of the first permanent suburban chapters in Displacement. Eventually, multiple Latin King groups were formed throughout the suburb. In Hotchkiss, low-budget government apartments along an isolated business park became home to one of the earliest suburban Latin King chapters in 1979. This group would remain active until the apartments were torn down in 2014. Meanwhile, Rolling Meadows saw Latin King activity by 1979, later documented in 1982 reports. They first moved into the troubled Arborview apartments near Route 53 and Algonquin Road, a crime-ridden complex since the late 1960s. By the early 1980s, the Latin Kings had expanded to the southeast side of Rolling Meadows, maintaining a presence in coach-like condos, East Park apartments, and Park Meadow apartments well into the modern era. The suburb of Summit also became a key stronghold. Latin Kings settled near 63rd Street and Harlem Avenue, a border area with rising Hispanic and African American populations. By 1990, their territory expanded to 63rd Street, making Summit one of the oldest and most enduring suburban chapters in Chicagoland. In Kane County, Latin Kings reached Aurora in 1979, connecting with local cocaine and heroin operations established by early arriving Chicago gangs, including the Insane Deuces. Economic decline and affordable housing drew Hispanic and African American families to the suburb, and the Latin Kings quickly embedded themselves in the community. Elgin saw a similar pattern, with Latin Kings integrating into existing Chicago to Milwaukee drug networks and establishing a permanent presence. Other Kane County suburbs like Carpentersville followed suit. Apartments and smaller homes along the eastern strip attracted Hispanic residents, with Latin Kings moving in to connect with Elgin and Aurora chapters and participate in regional drug trafficking networks. Joliet, situated near the correctional facility, became another focal point in 1979. White flight and the arrival of Hispanic and African American families created racial tensions, drawing youths to the Latin Kings for protection. As the first Chicago gang in Will County, they established a stronghold before other suburbs such as Bolingbrook or Romeoville saw any organized gang activity. Finally, Waukegan on the Lake County south side became a Latin King settlement in 1979 as Hispanic and African American families arrived in search of affordable housing following manufacturing decline. Latin Kings offered protection to youths facing harassment from local African American gangs and white groups, establishing a chapter that would endure for decades. By the close of 1979, the Latin Kings were no longer just a Chicago gang. They were a regional force, strategically embedded in suburbs across Cook, Kane, and Will counties, ensuring both protection for migrating Hispanic families and expansion of their network of influence. By 1979, the Latin Kings' suburban reach extended further across northern Illinois. In Rockford, white flight was accelerating as the city's manufacturing base began to crumble. Hispanic and African American families arriving from Chicago unsettled the mostly Italian community on the southeast side. Racial tensions and the need for protection likely prompted the arrival of Latin Kings in the Booker Park area. From their settlement, they quickly grew into one of Rockford's largest gangs, maintaining influence into the present era. Palatine seemed unlikely to host Chicago gangs, given its higher income levels and pricey housing. Yet in the far northeast side, low-income housing developments built in the 1970s in formerly unincorporated land created a fertile ground for gang activity. The notorious Rand Grove apartments became public housing by 1980. Latin Kings from Little Village moved into Palatine in 1979, becoming the first kings in the suburb, predating any later P-Town chapters. As the new decade dawned, Chicago itself saw continued territorial expansion. In 1980, the back of the Yards neighborhood on the south side underwent rapid racial transition. Hispanic families, once concentrated near 47th and Laughlin, spread southwest towards Sherman Park, triggering clashes with entrenched gangs like the Latin Souls and the Saints. The Latin Kings of 51st and Ada Street, organized by Diaper Deadeye of the Culture Latin Kings, moved into the area, quickly establishing dominance north of Sherman Park. Teaming up with Black P. Stones, they drove out the Latin Souls while simultaneously battling Gangster Disciples, Saints, 22 Boys, 26, City Knights, and La Raza, becoming known for wild parties and their hardcore reputation. In the suburbs, Latin Kings continued their spread. Bensenville saw Latin King activity by 1982, though the chapter likely started in 1979 or 1980. Early settlers moved into new low-income apartments, establishing a gang that would grow to rival the Imperial Gangsters and Spanish Cobras, remaining a major force in the village and perhaps the first Chicago gang to settle DuPage County. Nearby Bolingbrook and Woodridge became key Hispanic and African American enclaves around 1980. The influx of impoverished youths from Chicago brought the Latin Kings, who took root in apartment complexes like Wood Creek, Beacon Ridge, Innsbrook, and in home subdivisions such as Pepper Tree. Many members attended Romeoville High School, cementing their presence in local life. The Romeoville chapter itself was formalized in 1980 when Ken Curley, a former Little Village Latin King, assembled a 12-member group in the Poplar Ridge subdivision. Their mission was to stand up against racial discrimination while participating in local cocaine and marijuana distribution. After King Curley temporarily disbanded the chapter in 1986 due to legal issues, King Stretch, an original Maywood Latin King, resurrected the Romeoville chapter in 1987. The group thrived near St. Andrew's Church and Irene King Elementary, battling Gangster Disciples, 2-6, and Latin Counts, surviving major police raids in the mid-1990s. Meanwhile, in South Chicago, Latin Kings initially settled near 79th and Clarendon in 1979, moving north to the South Shore side before being temporarily disrupted by incarceration. By 1981, Ray and his crew shifted a few blocks south into South Chicago, establishing the notorious 89th and Muskegon chapter. This brand quickly became a permanent fixture, clashing with small gangs, Spanish Gangster Disciples, and eventually Latin Dragons and Latin Counts. Further south, the Pullman and Roseland neighborhoods saw Hispanic migration. By 1981, Latin Kings established two distinct groups: the Pullman Latin Kings at 113th and Langley, and the 115th and Champlain Roseland Latin Kings. Though technically still in Pullman, the latter took the Roseland moniker, likely because the Pullman name was already claimed. Both chapters became well known for their ferocity against Gangster Disciples, vice lords, and four-corner hustlers, while hosting some of the neighborhood's most infamous Latin King parties. By the early 1980s, the Latin Kings were no longer just a Chicago phenomenon. Their influence stretched from northern suburbs like Rockford and Palatine to south side neighborhoods and far-reaching suburbs, establishing a web of chapters that will remain active for decades. In April 1978, tensions inside Stateville Prison reached a breaking point. Inmates from Chicago's major gangs, fed up with harsh treatment and brutal conditions, came together to organize a nonviolent strike. Though the protests passed quietly, the aftermath reshaped Chicago's gang landscape forever. From these early alliances, two distinct coalitions emerged. By 1979, one faction had adopted the name Folks, while the other remained loosely organized, unwilling to tie themselves to formal identity. By 1981, Illinois' mass prison release program brought high-ranking Folks members back to the streets. The loosely organized faction, now ready to assert itself, convened under Jeff Fort of the E.L. Ruckins at the Fort. Leaders from the Latin Kings, Black P. Stones, E.L. Ruckins, and Vice Lords were summoned to formalize a new alliance, the People Nation. The iconic 5-point star was donated by the E.L. Ruckins as a symbol of peace among gangs not aligned with the Folks. Spirituality blended into this alliance. E.L. Ruckins, Black P. Stones, and Vice Lords represented the Islamic side of the People Nation, while the Latin Kings embodied the Christian essence. Members often referred to each other as brothers, forging bonds that squashed conflicts with the Latin counts, bishops, Puerto Rican stones, and gay lords, and even some vice lords for much of the 1980s, while drawing Latin kings closer to allies like Spanish lords, insane unknowns, and warlords. Meanwhile, the Latin kings continued expanding into suburban territories. In Cicero, previous settlement attempts had failed, first in the late 1960s and again in 1979 after the killing of their leader left the chapter directionless. By 1982, the Spanish Harlem Latin Kings established a permanent presence, branching into key areas like 14th and 57th Streets and Grant Works and 57th and Cermak. Within just a few years, the Cicero chapter grew strong, surviving decades of conflict and even facing a 1999 lawsuit from the city for persistent gang activity. To the northwest, Mount Prospect saw the arrival of impoverished Mexican families in the boxwood townhouses around 1982. Many youths faced isolation and discrimination, creating an opening for the Latin Kings to establish protection and guidance. Though they eventually moved from Boxwood, they embedded themselves in multiple apartment and townhouse complexes across Mount Prospect. Over the decades, the Mount Prospect Latin Kings fought and survived violent wars with Serenos, Satan Disciples, Maniac Latin Disciples, Tutu Boys, and other gangs, cementing their status as the dominant gang in Northwest Cook County. Not all Latin King stories were about expansion and protection. Some were the stuff of infamy. One such tale is the infamous Meatloaf story, chronicled by George W. Knox for the NGCRC. It centers on Carlos Robles, a Northside Latin King who had crossed Raul Rayo Gonzalez, a high-ranking Southside Latin King. With authorization from Lord Gino, Rayo and two accomplices, one a Cuban killer, the other a PCP-addicted white gang member, planned a gruesome execution in Statesville Prison. On the eve of Robles' parole in July 1983, he was lured to a prison basement under the guise of a parole party. There, the two men brutally killed Robles, dismembering his body and washing the crime away in the showers. The gruesome task of disposing of the remains fell to a rival black gangster disciple who helped grind Robles' body into meat mixed with pork and beef. The meatloaf was then served to unsuspecting inmates while the perpetrators abstained. The skull was buried discreetly and no one was ever prosecuted. Knox notes with grim irony that one of the killers later worked as a chef in a government cafeteria. This story illustrates the extreme lengths some Latin Kings would go to protect their code and enforce respect, a testament to the brutal yet methodical nature of gang life in Chicago during this era. The East Side neighborhood of Chicago, long rooted in the barge and steel industries, began to shift in the early 1980s. As steel mills shuttered, many far southeast side residents lost their jobs. Yet white flight here was slower than in other areas, thanks to the entrenched Eastern European community. Slowly, Mexican families began settling the East Side, only to face discrimination and hostility from some residents who feared changes to their cultural landscape. Gangs quickly filled this vacuum. The Simon City Royals already present made life difficult for these new families. By 1983, the Latin Kings moved into the east side to protect struggling youths and assert dominance. A war erupted, and the Latin Kings emerged victorious, diminishing the Royals' influence by the end of the decade. Attempts by the Spanish vicelords and King Cobras to establish a foothold failed, largely due to the east side Latin Kings' uncompromising control. The only real challenge came from the Latin Counts, who began as allies in the 1980s before becoming contenders in the 1990s. The Latin Kings solidified their position, remaining a powerful presence in the east side. Suburban Chicago also felt the ripple of gang migration during the mid-1980s. In Glendale Heights, a quiet middle-class suburb, Latin Kings connected to the high-ranking Boulevards faction moved on to Windsor Lane in 1985. These newcomers clashed violently with neighbors, selling drugs and asserting dominance. Hispanic families newly arrived to Glendale Heights gravitated toward the Latin Kings for protection against discrimination, sparking a local conflict. These kings became legendary through the 1980 and 1990, dominating drug and street activity until the village cracked down in 2000, after which few gangs survived, but their legacy remained. Nearby, Hanover Park experienced similar tensions in 1985. The Glendale Terrace Apartments, later Blue Apartments, saw whites leaving and impoverished African American and Mexican families moving in, isolated from the broader suburb. These conditions bred resentment and gang affiliation. The Boulevard's Latin Kings settled in the complex, fighting to secure their territory against gangster disciples, supported by Spanish Cobras and maniac Latin disciples. Despite being outnumbered initially, the Latin Kings prevailed, eventually taking full control of the complex. Police crackdowns in the late 1990s reduced their visibility, but the Latin Kings maintained a lasting presence in Hanover Park. Addison faced its own wave of gang activity during the mid-1980s. Apartment and condo complexes lost value, and landlords began housing impoverished Hispanic families from Chicago, drawing the ire of the predominantly Italian community. Latin Kings recruited among frustrated youth in the Lincoln Avenue apartments, soon establishing a foothold. Over time, they survived wars with Insane Deuces, Latin Counts, and La Raza, maintaining a presence despite declining activity. After the 1990s, by 1988, gang migration reached Streamwood, where the Robbinswood condo complex, now the Oaks, attracted impoverished Hispanic and African American families. Isolated from village resources and marginalized by schools, youths aligned with Chicago gang. The Latin Kings arrived in force, battling maniac Latin disciples, gangster disciples, familiar Stones, Serenos, and local Hanover Park gangs. Crackdowns in 1996 challenged their presence, but the Kings endured. Back on Chicago's south side, a new Latin King chapter emerged in Gage Park at 55th and Sacramento in 1988, originally known as the Devious Ones. Allies of the Southside Insane Popes and Southside Heads, they opposed groups like the Guest Boys, 2-6, and Ambrose. By 1990, they merged with the Latin Kings, recruiting additional allies and creating the notorious Crown Town Latin Kings. Finally, in 1990, Latin Kings reached Garfield Ridge. Blended into a community wary of Hispanic migration, they recruited white youths and allied with the Southside Insane Popes. This chapter, soon called the Midway Latin Kings, positioned itself against Saint Disciples and 2-6, becoming a deeply rooted and still active faction in the area. By 1990, the Latin Kings had cemented their presence across Chicago and its suburbs. One of the newest and most notorious chapters emerged at 55th to 59th and Pulaski in the West Elsdon community. Historically an all-white neighborhood with deep roots in racial tension, West Elsdon became fertile ground for gang activity. The Latin Kings arrived to manage the conflicts brought by demographic change, but soon their focus turned to violent turf wars with Satan disciples and 2-6, establishing a chapter that would become a fixture in the area for decades. Around the same period, an unusual chapter developed in Austin, at the border of the Cicero suburb near Roosevelt and Menard. This chapter, known as the Island, was composed almost entirely of African American members. Their recruitment followed clashes with the Latin Counts south of Roosevelt Road in the area called the Red Zone. These kings quickly gained a reputation for their ruthlessness, relentlessly challenging rival Latin Counts and gangster disciples. To this day, the Island remains an active and hardened Latin King chapter. After 1990, the expansion of major new territories slowed. Instead, the Latin kings focused on strengthening the neighborhoods and suburbs they already controlled. By the 1990s, they had become heavily invested in the drug trade, far beyond the earlier decades when only select heavy hitters handled distribution. This expansion included connections to the Italian mafia, international drug cartels, and operations in other US states and Mexico. With ties to Mexico, they were able to move kilograms of cocaine and heroin across the border. The largest Latin kings operated much like a mafia organization, while younger members patrolled the streets day and night, marking territory or selling small drug quantities. Their visibility was deliberate, a decades-long strategy to assert dominance and intimidate rivals. This openness, combined with high-stakes drug operations, fueled violent conflicts. Latin kings became notorious for their EBK, everybody killer, mentality, a philosophy rooted in the constant overlap of drug trade interests and territorial disputes. By the 1990s, even long-standing alliances, including the People Nation, were strained, and Latin kings found themselves at war with former allies such as Insane-Dices, Colatindices, Spanish Lords, Familiar Stones, Insane Unknowns, Four Corner Hustlers, and Puerto Rican Stones. Understanding the legacy of the Latin kings requires recognizing their organizational evolution. The almighty Latin king nation, AOKNN, with its distinctive colors, symbols, and sweaters, was founded by King Phil. Earlier Latin kings groups, including the legacy of Zuan King Papo Santos, existed independently before eventually merging into the AOKNN. It is unclear whether Santos and Phil were aware of each other during these formative years, but both legacies contributed to the modern structure of the nation.